The music stopped. Not gradually, not with the usual smooth fade that Doc Severinsen's band had perfected over thousands of shows. Just stopped. Johnny Carson had raised his hand, a simple gesture that every camera operator, every sound technician, every person in that NBC studio had learned to respect over 30 years of late-night television. But this wasn't supposed to happen. Carson never stopped the show. Not for technical difficulties, not for celebrity meltdowns, not for anything. Yet there he stood, microphone lowered, eyes fixed on the old man sitting in the guest chair who had just whispered something that changed everything. How did we get here? 30 minutes earlier, Harold Fletcher had been just another audience member. 82 years old, wearing his only suit, the same navy blue one he'd worn to his wife's funeral 6 months ago. His weathered hands clutched a small manila envelope, the kind that had once held military dispatches during his 3 tours in Korea. The Tonight Show had always been Harold's evening ritual. Every night at 11:30, he'd settle into his worn recliner with a cup of black coffee and watch Carson make America laugh. It was his connection to the world, his reminder that joy still existed somewhere beyond the silence of his empty house. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight, Harold had driven 3 hours from his small Pennsylvania town, had waited in line for 4 hours outside NBC's Burbank studios, all for a chance to see his hero in person. What he hadn't planned on was Carson's warm-up routine, where the host would sometimes venture into the audience to chat with visitors. "Where are you folks from tonight?" Carson had asked, his familiar voice cutting through the pre-show chatter. Hands shot up across the studio. Carson pointed to a young couple from Ohio, then an elderly woman from Florida, working his way through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who'd done this thousands of times. Carson stopped mid-sentence when he saw Harold. Something in the old man's eyes, a quiet desperation masked by dignity, made the host pause. The entire studio froze. "Sir, how about you? Where are you from?" Harold's voice cracked as he stood. "Harmony, Pennsylvania, Mr. Carson. I drove down just to see you." There was something in the way he said it. Not excitement, not the usual fan enthusiasm Carson was used to. This was deeper. More urgent. "That's quite a drive. What brings you all this way?" Harold's hands trembled as he reached for the envelope. "My wife Margaret, she passed 6 months ago. Lung cancer. She always said if she ever got the chance, she'd ask you something." The studio fell silent. Even the camera operators leaned in. Carson felt it. That shift every performer knows, when entertainment transforms into something else entirely. He built his career on perfect timing, on knowing exactly when to deliver a punchline or pivot to a commercial break. But this moment belonged to Harold. "What would she have asked me?" Harold opened the envelope with careful precision, the way old hands do when they're holding something precious. Inside was a photograph, black and white, creased with age, showing a young soldier and a beautiful woman in a wedding dress, dated 1952. She wanted to know if you'd help me say goodbye to her properly. The request hung in the air like smoke. Carson's writers had prepared jokes about politicians, movie stars, even a bit about his recent divorce. Nothing had prepared anyone for this. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Carson looked at his producer in the wings, who was frantically making cut gestures across his throat. They were supposed to start the actual show in minutes. Millions of viewers were expecting Johnny's monologue, celebrity guests, comedy sketches. They weren't expecting this. But Carson had built The Tonight Show on something more than just entertainment. He'd created a space where real human moments could happen, where the artificial boundaries between performer and audience could dissolve when it mattered most. He walked to Harold's seat. "Tell me about Margaret." Harold's voice steadied as he spoke. "We met at a USO dance in 1951. I was shipping out to Korea the next month, and she was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. Promised her I'd come back and marry her, and somehow I kept that promise. The photograph shook in his weathered hands. 38 years of marriage. She was there when I came home from the war with nightmares. She was there when I couldn't hold down a job because of what I'd seen. She never left my side. Carson knelt beside Harold's chair, something no talk show host had ever done on live television. The cameras followed instinctively, capturing something raw and unrehearsed. What did she want you to say goodbye to? Not to her. Harold's voice broke. To the guilt. The confession spilled out in fragments. How Harold had survived battles where better men had died. How he'd carried their dog tags home, their final letters to wives and mothers. How Margaret had watched him wake up screaming their names for decades, had held him through countless nights when the memories wouldn't fade. She made me promise that if I ever got the chance to speak to someone the whole country was listening to, I'd tell them about the boys who didn't make it home. She said maybe then I could finally let them rest. Carson's eyes filled with tears, something millions of Americans had never seen in 30 years of late-night television. From his jacket pocket, Harold pulled out a small velvet bag. Inside were 7 dog tags, each one representing a soldier who died in Harold's unit. He'd carried them for 35 years, their weight a constant reminder of survival and loss. Margaret said these boys deserved to have their names spoken on television, where their families might hear them. She said maybe someone watching would remember them too. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Carson stood and walked to his desk. He picked up his cue cards, the same ones that held his carefully crafted jokes, and set them aside. Then he returned to Harold, reaching for the bag of dog tags. What were their names? One by one, Harold recited them. Carson repeated each name slowly, clearly, his voice carrying across the studio and into living rooms across America. The band remained silent. The audience held its breath. Even the cameramen wiped their eyes as they kept filming. Private First Class David Chin, age 19, from San Francisco. Corporal Michael O'Brien, 21, from Boston. Sergeant James Washington, 24, from Birmingham. With each name, Harold's shoulders seemed to lighten. The weight he'd carried for 35 years was finally being shared with a nation that had forgotten these young men existed. When the last name was spoken, Carson did something unprecedented. He placed his hand on Harold's shoulder and spoke directly to the camera. These men died serving our country in Korea. They were sons, brothers, fathers. Tonight, because of Harold Fletcher's courage and his wife Margaret's wisdom, they're not forgotten anymore. The studio erupted in applause, but it wasn't the usual polite television audience applause. This was something deeper, a collective recognition of sacrifice and loss and the healing power of remembrance. Harold carefully placed the dog tags back in the velvet bag, but his hands were steady now. Margaret always said you were a good man, Mr. Carson. She was right. Carson's voice was thick with emotion. I think Margaret was the good one in your family, Harold. But you kept your promise to her. The show went to commercial, but the cameras kept rolling for a few more seconds, capturing Harold and Carson shaking hands, 2 men who had just shared something sacred on live television. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Later that night, after the official show had ended, Carson sat alone at his desk. The studio was empty except for the cleaning crew, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. In his 30 years of television, he'd interviewed presidents and movie stars, had delivered thousands of monologues to millions of viewers. But tonight felt different. Tonight, television had done something more than entertain. It had helped heal an old wound and honored the memory of soldiers whose names might otherwise have been lost to time. The next morning, NBC received over 10,000 calls from viewers. Many were veterans or family members of veterans, sharing their own stories of loss and survival. Several were from families of the 7 soldiers Harold had named, relatives who had never known what happened to their loved ones in Korea. But the call that mattered most came from Harold himself. Mr. Carson. His voice was stronger than it had been in months. I wanted to thank you. I slept through the night for the first time since Margaret died. She always said laughter was the best medicine, but last night you showed me that sometimes the best medicine is just being heard. Carson had always believed that his job was to make people laugh, to provide a few minutes of escape from whatever troubles filled their days. That night with Harold Fletcher taught him something else, that sometimes the most important thing a person with a platform could do was simply listen. Years later, when Carson retired from The Tonight Show, he kept 3 things from his decades on television: his original microphone, a photo with his son, and Harold Fletcher's manila envelope. Inside that envelope, Harold had left something for Carson to keep, a small note from Margaret, written just weeks before she died. "Dear Mr. Carson," it read, "if Harold ever gets the courage to visit your show, please be kind to him. He's carried too much for too long, and he deserves to lay down his burden. Thank you for being America's friend all these years. Some of us needed one." The note wasn't signed, but Carson kept it in his desk drawer for the rest of his life. It reminded him that behind every laugh, every round of applause, every viewer tuning in each night, there were real people with real struggles who just needed to know they weren't alone. Harold Fletcher lived another 8 years, long enough to see Carson's final episode in 1992. He never missed a show, and according to his neighbors, he never had another sleepless night troubled by the war. This isn't just a story about a late-night talk show or even about a veteran's final request. It's about the moment when entertainment became human connection, when laughter took a back seat to listening, and when one man's platform became a bridge between the living and the dead. Carson never spoke publicly about that night with Harold Fletcher, but those who worked with him said it changed how he approached the show. He listened more carefully to his guests, paid attention to the audience members who seemed to have something important to say, and never forgot that the most powerful moments on television happened when the cameras captured real human truth. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone isn't our wisdom or our solutions. Sometimes it's simply the chance to be heard, to have their story matter, to know that their burden doesn't have to be carried alone. But the story of Harold Fletcher and Johnny Carson didn't end that night in 1987. 3 months later, Harold received an unexpected package at his small Pennsylvania home. Inside was a leather-bound album filled with photographs and letters from families of the 7 soldiers whose names Carson had spoken on television. David Chen's younger sister had written from San Francisco. "I was 8 when my brother died in Korea. I never understood what happened to him until I heard Mr. Fletcher speak his name on television. Thank you for carrying his memory all these years." Michael O'Brien's nephew, now a father himself, had sent a photo of his newborn son. "We named him Michael David, after the uncle I never met. Because of your courage, his name lives on in our family." Each letter carried the same message: gratitude for keeping their loved ones' memories alive, for ensuring they weren't just names on a distant memorial wall but real people who had mattered to someone. Harold kept every letter, just as he had kept those dog tags for 35 years. But now the weight was different. Instead of carrying guilt, he was carrying love, the love of families who had finally found closure, who had finally learned what happened to their boys in Korea. 6 months after the Tonight Show appearance, Harold did something he hadn't done since Margaret's funeral. He smiled at a stranger. It happened at the local grocery store, when a young veteran approached him. "You're Harold Fletcher, aren't you? I saw you on Carson's show. I served in Vietnam and I've been carrying some things too." Harold listened as the young man told his story, offered the same gift that Carson had given him. The simple act of bearing witness to pain that had been carried in silence for too long. Word spread quietly through the veteran community. Harold's small house became an unlikely gathering place for men who had served in different wars but carried the same invisible wounds. They would sit on his porch, drinking coffee from Margaret's china cups, sharing stories that their families couldn't understand. Harold never called it therapy or counseling. He just called it listening. And somehow, that was enough. Carson never publicized what he'd done that night, never used it for promotional material or awards consideration. But the producers noticed changes in how he interacted with audience members during warm-ups. He lingered longer with older guests, listened more carefully to their stories, and occasionally would signal the cameras to keep rolling when something meaningful was happening. The manila envelope that Harold had carried to the show became a symbol for something larger. Carson had it framed and hung in his private office, not as a trophy but as a reminder of what television could accomplish when it stopped trying to be perfect and started trying to be human. Years later, when journalism students would ask Carson about his greatest moment on television, he never mentioned the celebrity interviews or the famous comedy bits. He would tell them about Harold Fletcher, about the night he learned that the most important conversations happen when you put down your script and simply listen. The night Harold Fletcher walked into NBC's Burbank studios, he was carrying the weight of 7 dead soldiers and 35 years of survivors' guilt. He left carrying something different. The knowledge that their sacrifice had been witnessed, their names had been spoken, and their memory would live on in the hearts of families who had finally found peace. That night, Johnny Carson didn't just host a television show. He held space for a man's grief, honored the memory of forgotten soldiers, and reminded an entire nation that behind every uniform, every name on a memorial wall, there's a story worth remembering.